Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my channel, where today we have Stardom Situm Week 5 Quarterback Edition, where we're going to be going through each and every game and giving you the best fantasy advice possible. The first game we've got on the list is the Thursday night game, the Bears versus the Commanders. Now, first off, we have Justin Fields, who's going to be a start. Washington, since Week 2, has given up 25, 22, and 24 fantasy points to quarterbacks respectively, and these are all running quarterbacks that gain quite a bit of yards on the ground. So Justin Fields and getting 11, 12 carries a game, he should be able to feast here. The Commanders give up the third most points per game total and allow 18 points per game to quarterbacks, that's including Josh Dobbs minus 2 points per point game in Week 1, and that'd be the 11th most, so you're going to want to start Justin Fields here. Now, as for Sam Howell, you're actually going to very much want to start him. Chicago versus quarterbacks has not been great. They've given up 22, 18, 25, and 22 points to their quarterbacks respectively. They have the 5th most defense given up and the 2nd most points given up. They average just about 22 fantasy points per game given up to quarterbacks, and that's the 2nd most in the NFL, so these are both going to be an easy start. Next up, we have the Bills versus the Jaguars in London. This is pretty simple. Josh Allen's always a start, and you should never bench him, but Jacksonville gives up 17 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 10th most rushing yards. They've tied for the 8th most passing touchdowns given up and the 12th most passing yards given up in the NFL. And Josh Allen has averaged 27.16 fantasy points per game since Week 2, so he's killing it. As for Trevor Lawrence, Buffalo allows the 5th least passing yards per game in the NFL and the 2nd least total points per game in the entire NFL. They've allowed 3 passing touchdowns, but they've also forced 8 interceptions. And they average just about 7 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, which is the best defense to quarterbacks in the entire NFL. So you're going to want to sit Trevor Lawrence and avoid him if at all possible. As for the next game, we're going to have the Falcons taking on the Texans. We're going to want to start CJ Stroud. He's averaging 18.6 fantasy points per game, which is the 10th most. He's also thrown 0 interceptions and 1,200 passing yards, which is good enough to be the 4th most in the NFL. The Falcons have a decent pass defense thus far into the season, but I think that CJ Stroud has been really talented, and he's too good right now not to start. As for Desmond Ridder, the Texans allowed 13.59 fantasy points per game, which is the 10th least in the NFL. They allowed the least amount of passing touchdowns with 2, and Ridder is barely averaging 11.46 total fantasy points per week, and just over 6 the last 2 weeks, so he is not playing good. Unless you're absolutely forced to start him because you have no other choice, he should not be touching any starting position for quarterback. Next up, we have the Lions versus the Panthers. Now, as for Jared Goff, Detroit is averaging the 8th most passing yards per game with 250 in the NFL. Carolina is only giving up 10.16 fantasy points, which comes out to the 4th least. But Goff is averaging above 17. So because he's in the top half, I'm leaning toward the start. Carolina does have some good pass defense. However, you may not have any other options, so we're going to lean toward a start here for Goff. As for Bryce Young, he's only averaging 9.07 fantasy points per game over his 3 starts that he's had thus far. He has absolutely no upside right now, so there's not really any point in playing him, even if he has a good enough matchup. You shouldn't trust Bryce Young. You should avoid him, if at all. In our next matchup, we have the Colts versus the Titans. We're going to want to start Anthony Richardson. He has 4 rushing touchdowns, most amongst quarterbacks, and the 5th most overall for anybody. 22.4 fantasy points per game, which is the highest as a rookie, 3rd highest QB overall. And the Titans' defense has only gotten 1 takeaway through the air, tied for almost last. Richardson is averaging 44 rushing yards per game with 1 rushing touchdown per game. That comes out to about 10 fantasy points just alone, not even including whatever passing yards he gets. He's got too much good value to bench. As for Ryan Tannehill, he is averaging 10.3 total fantasy points per game. It's the 4th worst amongst starters. The Titans average a total of 280 yards per game, which is the 5th least, and Tannehill's 2 to 4 touchdown to interception ratio has him at the 4th most interceptions and tied for the least amount of thrown touchdowns. There's no reason to start Tannehill, even if it's against the Colts. He just has no upside here. Next up, we have the Dolphins versus the Giants. The Giants only average giving up about 17 fantasy points per game to the quarterback, but the Dolphins have a high-powered offense, 511 yards per game total. That's the first in the NFL, first in passing, first in rushing. They scored the most points offensively in the NFL, and the Giants have allowed the 3rd most points per game in the NFL. Tua is playing like a real MVP candidate, and he should be started everywhere. Now, as for Danny Dimes, Miami is giving up 21.26 fantasy points per game, which is the 3rd most. However, Daniel Jones has scored 10 points or under, including this past week on Monday Night Football. In 3 of his 4 games, he's been under. He also is tied for the league lead in interceptions and has quite a number of fumbles to go with it. He's only averaging 158 passing yards per game, which is the 3rd least. There's no reason to start him, even though Miami's defense is giving up a lot of points to the quarterback. You can't risk it based off of how Danny Dimes has played so far. Next, we've got the Patriots versus the Saints. Now, as for the Saints, we're going to want to sit Derek Carr. New England only allows 11.52 points per quarter to the quarterback position, was the 5th least, and only 3 touchdowns, tied for the 3rd least. Carr has only passed 10 fantasy points once, and that was week 1. So he's not really putting up any fantasy points, so I would avoid him if at all possible. The Saints versus quarterbacks, Mac Jones has a decent matchup here, I guess. The Saints defense has given up an average of 24 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks to quarterbacks. But the Saints are tied for 4th most interceptions in the league. Mac Jones has a 5 to 4 touchdown to interception ratio. And he's only gone over 15 fantasy points once. The Saints give up under 200 passing yards per game, and with Mac Jones' recent struggles, I don't see him improving or taking that step here against the Saints. Next up, we have the Steelers versus the Ravens. Lamar, you're going to want to start Lamar. I bet on against him last week, and it didn't work out. He's averaging 18 fantasy points per game in his career versus the Steelers. Right now, he's currently averaging 55 rushing yards per game and 1 rushing touchdown. So that's about 11 points right there. And the Steelers give up 20 points per game to quarterbacks over the last 2 weeks. Pickett is also out, so with no starting quarterback over there, they should be giving the ball back to the Ravens to allow Lamar to score more points. So he's a definite start. As for Mitch Trubisky, the Ravens give up 10.1 fantasy points per game to quarterback, which is the 3rd least, and they have the 25th most passing yards per game with under 200. Ravens are averaging 3rd least total yards per game at 260, and frankly, Mitch Trubisky in general just hasn't been the greatest quarterback, so there's no reason to start him even in this divisional matchup. In our next game, we have the Cardinals versus the Bengals. For Dobbs is averaging 21.56 fantasy points over the last 3 weeks with 0 interceptions and 4 touchdowns. He's also averaging 48 rushing yards per game. Cincinnati gives up the 4th most rushing yards to quarterbacks, so Dobbs should have ample opportunities to use his athleticism and get the ball down the field. I think he's an easy start. He has given me no reason not to start him, and he's actually improved as the season has went on. As for Joe Burrow, we're going to also want to start him. However, He has the lowest fantasy point total among starting quarterbacks, and it's like not even close. But Arizona does give up the ninth most passing yards per game and the seventh most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Frankly, the Bengals offense is too talented not to just want to start Joey Burrow. We know how talented he is and how talented the players are around him. So there should be no reason as not to start him. Rams versus Eagles is up next. These ones are pretty easy. Matt Stafford is averaging the second most passing yards per game. And the Eagles give up 260 passing yards per game for the sixth most. They also have allowed the third most passing touchdowns, and I think with how often Matt Stafford and the Rams throw the ball, he should have a lot of opportunities to score points. And I think that the Rams' offense is looking pretty solid, so I think he's going to get the start. As for Jalen Hurts, the Rams have only forced one interception this year, tied for 31st. He averages 21.2 fantasy points per game, the fifth most for quarterbacks, and the Eagles average the fifth most yards per game in the NFL. Jalen Hurts is an obvious start. He's just too good not to start, and that offense just gets things done, especially on the goal line. This may be my most controversial one yet. Zach Wilson and Russell Wilson are both going to be starts for me. As for Russell Wilson, he's currently averaging just under 20 fantasy points per game. He's not having a bad year. 10th most. He's tied for the second most pass touchdowns in the NFL. But the Jets are tied for the fourth most interceptions in the NFL. Russell Wilson, though, he has the third highest pass rating in the NFL, so he's playing really well. So, as bad as the Broncos seem to be, Russell Wilson is playing really well fantasy-wise, so he should be a start here against the Jets. As for Zach Wilson, the Broncos give up the most passing touchdowns in the NFL right now, and the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks with just under 25. They have but the Jets do have the second worst passing offense in the NFL, and Wilson is only averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game. The big difference here, I think, is the Broncos' defense and how poor it is. If there was any week you were gonna ever start Zach Wilson, this would be the week. This is probably your only week to do so. Next up, we have Pat Mahomes and Captain Kirko. They're both going to be starts here. Mahomes is averaging just under 21 fantasy points per game, ninth most in the NFL. And the Vikings give up about 19.3 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, which is the 10th most. They also only have one interception, and nobody in their right mind should ever bench Patrick Mahomes. Let's be honest. The Chiefs, they allow just under 200 passing yards per game, which is the 8th least, and only 15 points per game total, also for the 5th least. Chiefs allow 13.28 fantasy points per game, which is the 9th least in the NFL, but Kirk has the 3rd most passing yards in the NFL and the most passing touchdowns. He also has the 7th most fantasy points, and I think with how explosive the Vikings offense can be, that's the reason why you want to start Captain Kirk here, especially because there aren't going to be many other good options. Next, we've got Sunday Night Football, the 49ers versus the Cowboys. They're both going to be benches. Dallas allows the second least fantasy points per game to quarterbacks with just over 8, and the least amount of total points per game in the NFL. They allow the second least total passing yards per game, but Purdy does have the 11th most fantasy points, and he hasn't thrown a single pick. He takes care of the ball pretty well. However, because of how stingy Dallas's defense is, I don't see a good reason to start Purdy if you have another option to choose over him. As for Dak, the 49ers allow only 12.81 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, 7th least, and they have the 3rd least total points per game allowed. Prescott's only averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game, 23rd in the NFL. Even though his team seems to be dominating, he's not really performing fantasy-wise well, as he's finished in the bottom half in fantasy quarterbacks every single week so far in the NFL season. And last but not least, we have the Monday Night Football game, Jordan Love and Jimmy G, Raiders versus Packers. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Jordan Love. He's averaging 22.06 fantasy points per game. It's good enough to be just about third in the NFL. He has 8 passing touchdowns, which is tied for the 5th most. The Raiders also give up just over 20 fantasy points per game, which is good enough to be 9th most, and have given up 8 passing touchdowns on defense, which is good enough to be 4th most. So Jordan Love has a good matchup here against a bad Raiders defense. He should be started. Jimmy G, on the other hand, he's thrown 6 interceptions, which ties for the league lead. He's averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game. 15.42 fantasy points per game in 3 starts, and the Raiders are averaging 50.5 points total per game, tied for the 4th least. They also have the 7th least total yards per game with 281. I don't see any reason to start really anybody on this Raiders offense besides maybe Devontae Adams. So Jimmy G is going to be a sit for me. I don't see any good reason to play him, so you guys should bench him if you can. And that's going to be it. If you guys like this video, or you guys want to see more videos like this in the future, where I go with each position and I do start 'em, sit 'em, make sure you guys smash that subscribe button. Like if you're new here, comments if you're new here, and I will catch you guys in the next fantasy video. Peace.